improvise, adapt, and overcome.
Congress did not vote to remove the latest U.S.-Israel defense provision from the National Defense Authorization Act. They made sure most members of Congress never had to vote on it at all. And that difference matters because in a republic, a vote leaves fingerprints, names, positions, accountability. You vote yes, you own it. You vote no, you own that too. And when an amendment gets buried in the Rules Committee, there is no clean roll call, no public debate on the merits, no elected representative has to stand in front of American people and explain exactly what they are supporting or exactly why they oppose it. That is what happened with the Massey-Khanna Amendment. Republican Thomas Massey and Democrat Ro Khanna came together to remove Section 219 from the House version of the 2027 National Defense Authorization Act. That should get your attention. These two men are not political allies in the traditional sense. They come from different ideological camps. They disagree on plenty, but they agree on one thing. A provision this consequential deserved a public vote. The House Rules Committee did not make their amendment eligible for consideration. So the full House never debated it. The full House never voted on it. And the American people never got a clean record showing who supported it and who opposed it. Now, before anybody runs to their corners, let's slow this down a little bit because this story is already being distorted by both sides. One side is saying this provision hands Israel control of the Pentagon. That is not true. The other side is saying this is nothing more than routine cooperation between close partners. That is not true either. Now, the truth sits in the space most people avoid. Section 219 would create a formal United States-Israel Defense Technology Cooperation Initiative. It would direct the Secretary of Defense to establish an executive agent inside the DoD responsible for coordinating and accelerating defense technology cooperation between the United States and Israel. And the words matter. Research, development, testing, evaluation, acquisition, procurement, licensing, joint ventures, co-production, all integration into Americans' weapons systems, integration into programs of record. Now, be clear, this is not just aid. That is architecture. That is infrastructure. That is the beginning of institutional fusion. And the technology areas involved are not small. We're talking about artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, missile and air defense, counter-drone technology, electronic warfare, cyber defense, directed energy, advanced sensors, quantum technology, biotechnology, subterranean warfare, tunnel detection, data fusion, contested logistics. These are not yesterday's capabilities. These are the systems that will shape tomorrow's battlefield. The strongest argument in favor of this initiative is simple. Israel has spent years operating under persistent missile, drone, cyber, tunnel, and electronic warfare threats. Their defense ecosystem moves fast. A problem shows up in combat, operators report it, engineers study it, companies modify the technology, and new capability gets pushed back towards the field. I hate to say it, but the United States is not always that fast. Hell, most of the time, we're not even in the same time zone. The American acquisition system can take years to solve a problem that changed 6 months ago. I know, I worked in that ecosystem. The threat is moving at the speed of software. We are still moving at the speed of paperwork. So yes, there is value in learning from a partner with recent operational experience. There is value in testing Israeli technology. There is value in using systems that work. A Marine sitting in a fighting hole does not care whether the technology was developed in Tel Aviv, Texas, or Toledo. He cares whether it keeps the drone from reaching his position. He cares whether the missile gets intercepted. He cares whether the sensor finds the tunnel. He cares whether the system works when people are trying to kill him. That is the operational case, and it is a legitimate one. But capability is not the only issue. Sovereignty matters, oversight matters, freedom of action matters, and dependency matters, because once a foreign technology enters an American program of record, the relationship changes. Now you have contracts, software, training, maintenance, intellectual property, production lines, supply chains, technical data, spare parts, congressional districts, corporate interests, jobs, lobbyists, senior officers, program managers, and eventually an entire ecosystem built around keeping that capability alive. You do not just shut that down with a policy memo. You do not just cut it like an annual appropriation. You have created switching costs. You have created dependencies. You have created institutions whose continued existence may depend on the relationship continuing. That is how strategic lock-in works. Not with a dramatic announcement, not with a flag ceremony, not with a treaty. It happens one contract at a time, one software update at a time, one factory at a time, one program of record at a time, until the system is no longer merely cooperating, it is depending. And when dependency begins shaping strategy, the question becomes, who still has freedom of action? Now let's talk about the phrase executive agent. Some people hear that and think an Israeli official is being placed inside the Pentagon. That is false. The executive agent would be an American Department of Defense official or organization. It would operate under authority granted by the United States Secretary of Defense. It would not command American forces. It would not give Israel authority over American operations. It would not create a joint military command. It would not automatically provide unlimited access to classified information. But do not underestimate what an executive agent can do. An executive agent becomes the bureaucratic center of gravity. It coordinates, it advocates, it identifies funding requirements, it pushes programs forward, it resolves friction, it keeps the issue alive across administrations. And once a bureaucracy has ownership, it seeks resources. Once it gets resources, it creates programs. Once it creates programs, those programs create constituencies, and constituencies fight to survive. That is not conspiracy. That is organizational behavior. Anybody who has spent time in the military, especially in the Pentagon, understands it. Every office becomes a mission. Every mission becomes a budget, and every budget becomes a requirement. Every requirement eventually becomes something nobody remembers how to shut down, except for maybe Doge. Now, here is where the story gets more important. The House provision is not operating alone. The Senate has its own version. Section 1217 of the Senate NDAA creates a parallel United States-Israel Defense Technology Initiative. And in some areas, the Senate language goes even further. It directly connects cooperation to Golden Dome missile defense. It expands reporting on production locations. It addresses cost sharing. It looks at technologies moving into American acquisition programs and fielded systems. And it asks what additional resources and authorities may be needed for long-term integration. That means the real fight is no longer just inside the House. Even if House opponents eventually remove Section 219, Senate negotiators can put similar language back during conference. And because both chambers are now carrying versions of the same concept, some form of this initiative has a strong chance of surviving. The question is no longer whether the idea is alive. It is. The question is, what does the final version look like? How much authority does it have? How permanent does it become? How much oversight is built in, and how difficult will it be to unwind? Now, let's be fair. The House NDAA itself later stalled, but not because Congress suddenly revolted over Israel. The procedural rule failed after Republicans fought leadership over voter identification legislation. Different issue, same faction, same result. The defense bill stopped moving for now. Now, do not confuse those two events. The Massey-Khanna amendment was blocked from floor consideration. The larger NDAA later stalled over a completely separate political fight. Those are not the same story, and anybody combining them is either careless or selling you something. So let's get to the strategic risk. The legislation does not create a mutual defense treaty. It does not automatically pull the United States into an Israeli war. But deeper technological and industrial integration changes the cost of separation. If American missile defense depends on jointly developed systems, if American counter-drone programs rely on foreign-controlled software, if American weapons platforms depend on foreign technical data, if critical components come from a supply chain we do not fully control, then future American leaders may discover that strategic independence exists more on paper than in practice. That is not automatic entanglement. It is dependency by design, and dependency can become a form of leverage. Maybe intentional, maybe not, but the effect is the same. Excuse me. The more integrated the systems become, the more expensive it becomes to walk away, and adversaries will notice. Iran will not care what the congressional findings say. Iran will care what the network looks like. If the weapons are integrated, if the missile defense is integrated, if the data is shared, if the industrial base is connected, if American and Israeli companies are building the same systems, then Iranian planners may stop seeing two separate defense ecosystems. They may see one. That could improve deterrence. It could also expand the target set. I'm talking about American bases, American contractors, American supply chains, American forces. Deterrence and exposure often arrive in the same package, and anybody telling you otherwise is selling fantasy. Now, let's talk about counterintelligence. Every joint program creates opportunity, and every opportunity creates vulnerability. More engineers, more contractors, more software, more repositories, more test data, more research institutions, more licensing agreements, more subcontractors, and more people touching a lot of sensitive information. And the biggest threat may not be the partner. It may be everybody targeting the partnership: China, Russia, Iran, cybercriminal organizations, private intelligence networks, commercial espionage. Any expanded U.S.-Israel defense technology system would immediately become a high-value intelligence target. So the standard cannot be trust. The standard has to be verification, independent security review, continuous counterintelligence assessment, cyber audits, export control enforcement, end-use monitoring, supply chain mapping, because allies have interests, partners have interests, and the United States has interests. Those interests overlap. They are not identical. That is not an insult. That is reality. Healthy alliances do not fear boundaries. Healthy alliances require them. Now, there is also the question of intellectual property. Where is the technology developed? Who owns the source code? Who controls the software updates? Who holds the technical data? Can the United States repair the system without foreign approval? Can we produce it during a diplomatic dispute? Can we modify it without violating license agreements? Can we sustain it during a war? Is the technology American built, or is it merely assembled in America while the critical intellectual property remains controlled somewhere else? Because a factory on American soil does not automatically equal American sovereignty. If someone else controls the code, the data, or the key components, you may own the building and still not own the capability. That is the kind of question Congress should be asking publicly and on the record. Instead, leadership prevented a direct vote, and that may be the most damaging part of this entire process. Not because the provision is automatically bad, not because cooperation with Israel is automatically wrong, but because major strategic decisions should survive public scrutiny. If the initiative is good for American national security, then make the case, explain it, debate it, vote on it. For God's sake, own it. Don't hide behind procedure. Do not make a decision this consequential and then pretend it is too complicated for the American people to understand. We understand more than Washington thinks. We understand that useful technology can save American lives. We also understand that alliances can become dependencies. We understand that cooperation can strengthen deterrence. We also understand that integration can reduce freedom of action. Both things can be true. That is what a serious strategy looks like, not slogans, trade-offs. Now, here's the bottom line. The United States should use the best technology available. We should work with allies. We should learn from partners with recent operational experience. We should move faster. We should field capability before the threat outruns us. But every partnership must answer one question. Does it increase American freedom of action or quietly reduce it? That should be the standard. Not loyalty to a foreign government, not hostility toward a foreign government, American national interest, American readiness, American sovereignty, American accountability. If this initiative moves forward, it needs hard guide rails, permanent oversight, independent audits, counterintelligence review, clear IP rights, transparent cost sharing, domestic production requirements, and a sunset clause, as well as reauthorization requirements, and an absolute guarantee that the United States retains sovereign control over acquisition, operations, exports, modification, and termination. No partner gets a blank check. No ally gets immunity from oversight. And no American politician should be allowed to avoid accountability by burying a consequential decision inside parliamentary procedure. This is not about being pro-Israel. This is not about being anti-Israel. This is about whether the United States can cooperate without becoming dependent, whether we can integrate capability without surrendering flexibility, whether we can build alliances without building obligations we cannot later escape. That is the real fight, not the headline, not the talking points, not the tribal nonsense. Capability, sovereignty, oversight, freedom of action, those are the fundamentals. And if Congress is going to change the architecture of one of America's most consequential defense relationships, then every member should be willing to put their name on the decision. No shadows, no procedural camouflage, no fingerprints wiped clean. Stand up, vote, and then own it. Welcome to the Carry On Podcast for the week of July 11th. I am your host and guide to the world melting down, Brad Colbert, the Iceman. I hope all of you listening celebrated American Independence Day on July 4th. One of my favorite ways to celebrate it was when I was in England by inviting folks over to grill and eat classic hot dogs and hamburgers and enjoy the occasion. Trust me, the irony was not lost on anyone, and everyone was a good sport about it. This year, it was particularly special as we recognized and honored our birthday as a nation. That day, 250 years ago, when we decided to throw off the yoke of tyranny and declare we are a free nation. Today, democracy is a minority. Today, over 71% of the world's population, almost 5.5 billion, live under a theocracy. That is the highest in modern history and a very disturbing trend. Countries like America and its allies fight to change that. I hope all of you listening are joining in that fight. Freedom is an inalienable right of all people. I spent over 2 decades prepared to defend that right with my life, as so many are at this very moment prepared to do the same. Please take a moment to remember that and never take your freedom for granted. And just to be fair to my friends across the pond, I am enjoying a gin and tonic this evening. Of course, quinine designed to prevent malaria, and it is the season for malaria. So I encourage all of you to follow my example and consume a healthy supply of gin and tonic. My gin of choice is Hendrick's. They make a wonderful expression in a couple of different flavors. I encourage it. Of course, the amount of tonic water you add is completely user's preference. You're going to need some, though. Otherwise, it's just not a gin and tonic. A little bit of lime doesn't hurt either, right? You want to prevent scurvy as well. This evening, we will explore a little deeper into the opening monologue. We will check in with the dumpster fire that is the former Iran-U.S. ceasefire. We're going to check out the Kraken, unmanned surface vessel, mostly because I get to say, release the Kraken, which is the best. I will also be answering a listener's question, and I'm going to try to do that every week from now on. We had a ton of questions in the AMAs. All 3 episodes are out, by the way. I hope you enjoyed them. Great questions. We will do it again. People have asked. Yes. Keep sending your questions in. I'm going to trickle onesies in each week during the SITREP, but trust me, we will bundle and have Miss Anna, or the AI that we call Anna, on the show to help read the questions. It's going to be great. I do want to thank our latest Patreon supporter, Lynn's Lou. Appreciate the support. Look forward to having you join the conversation. And speaking of conversation, we do put out a wonderful newsletter. It has a movie recommendation or a book recommendation, a drink pairing to go with it, and then insight and highlights about things that are coming up, things that are current. And all of that can be found at the website. So bradcolbert.us. If you want to sign up for the newsletter, great. Also, for those folks that are on our Patreon program, check your email. We need your shirt sizes so we can send out your swag. Okay. So without further ado, let's grab our drinks and get to it. So the U.S.-Israel Defense Technology Initiative proposal. It's wonky, it's technical, and it's going to put most of us to sleep. So I am simply going to say this. It is potentially hugely beneficial for both sides, operationally, technically, and financially, which means ideologically, several members of Congress oppose it. And this is where I get so frustrated with our elected officials. Instead of looking at facts and weighing arguments of merit and substance, they vote based off emotion and reading the room. Now, vote with your conviction, sure, but for God's sake, have an ethos. Stop blowing with whatever wind comes your way. Do research and make an informed decision. So if I was to paraphrase the NDAA, let's have a quick blurb about it. If you're not tracking, Congress is working on the 2027 defense budget bill. It's called the NDAA. Now, hidden inside this massive bill, and it is massive, is a proposal to create a permanent partnership linking Israeli military technology directly into the U.S. military. This isn't just sending money or weapons to Israel like we've done in the past. It is an effort to permanently weave Israeli technology like AI, anti-drone systems, and missile defense into how the U.S. designs, builds, and buys its own weapons. So here's where things stand right now. As of this month, this is not a law yet, and the situation is very messy. In the House of Representatives, a bipartisan group of lawmakers tried to remove the Israel provision from the bill. However, House leadership used procedural rules to block them from even having a public recorded vote on it. Shortly after, the entire House defense bill stalled completely over an unrelated argument about voter ID laws. Now, in the Senate, in the upper house, the Senate has introduced its own version of the exact same idea because both the House and Senate independently want this. Experts estimate there is an 80% chance some version of this initiative will become law later this year. So, why is this different from normal aid? I'm glad you asked. Usually the U.S. gives Israel financial aid to buy weapons, and Congress debates this amount every year. This new initiative changes the model completely. The new model is, instead of just writing a check, U.S. and Israel will co-develop technology. That technology will then be built into official U.S. military software and hardware. To manage this, the House wants to appoint a specific boss inside the Pentagon. That's the executive agent I spoke of, whose sole job cuts through all the red tape and fast-track Israeli tech into American hands. Now, there's pros and cons. Here's the benefits. And this is why some supporters want it. You get faster tech updates. Traditional U.S. military procurement, notoriously slow. We've talked about it before. Israel operates in constant conflict, which means that they test, fix, and update their military technology, like drones and cyber warfare, incredibly fast. It's a lot better protection for U.S. troops because supplying American troops with proven technology to fight off cheap enemy drones or missiles, it saves lives. Here's some cons, the risks. This is why some critics are worried. It creates a long-term dependency. Once Israeli software and parts are built into the United States weapon systems, then the U.S. has to keep working with Israel to maintain, update, and fix its own system. Spying and the cyber risks is another one. So sharing a lot of these integrated software networks does open up more opportunities for adversaries like China, Russia, and Iran to hack or spy on U.S. systems. Another con is loss of freedom. If the U.S. military becomes dependent on shared technology, it makes it much harder for a future U.S. president to stay neutral or alter foreign policy during a Middle East conflict. There's also no public accountability. By blocking a vote on the House floor, politicians avoided having to publicly state where they stand on a massive shift in foreign policy. There are several House of Representatives elected officials, House of Representative elected officials who are on record as opposing this. It's in the public record. You can look it up. You don't need me. I'm not going to call them out by name, but it's the usual suspects, and that's why I said most of their dissent is on ideological grounds and not on the merit. And it's bullshit. It's petty and it's childish and we get the elected officials we deserve. Okay, all clear? Everybody good? We understand it now. We will follow this closer as it moves and update you when it happens. So the 800-pound gorilla of this week, the failed ceasefire. I'm not going to call it a peace plan because it wasn't. It was a ceasefire, and according to the administration, it's over. And it was declared to be over pretty loud, pretty publicly. And there were strikes as of, the last 48 hours. Yeah, it's going to be kind of a long discussion because there's a lot here to unpack. I'll do my best to unpack it. You may want to pause and refresh your drink. I'm still good, so don't worry about me. The current escalation in the Middle East, it's no longer really a collection of separate crises. You had Ali Khamenei's death and the funeral. You had Mutab, I'm not going to pronounce it right. I'll try. All right. His son and apparently heir replacement. His unexplained public absence, the reported Israeli interest in targeting Iran's principal negotiators, the deterioration of the U.S.-Iran ceasefire, all of it, renewed attacks on commercial shipping, and the widening exchange of U.S. and Iranian strikes. All of these are now interconnected elements of one massive strategic struggle. Basically, who will determine the political order that follows the Iran war? And whether Iran survives as a constrained regional power, does it remain an armed revolutionary state with control over the Strait of Hormuz? Or is subjected to continuing military degradation intended to prevent its recovery? The immediate military center of gravity here, folks, has shifted from Iran's nuke program and is squarely in the Strait of Hormuz. We've talked about it. They have demonstrated that that is a capability they're willing to exploit. The deeper political center of gravity is the survival and authority of the Iranian state. Right now, the United States appears to want an Iran that is weakened, that is constrained, and that is unable to threaten maritime commerce or rebuild any unrestricted nuclear program. But the United States still wants them coherent enough to negotiate, implement agreements, and prevent regional collapse, which would be massively worse, quite frankly. Now, Israel may be pursuing a more expansive objective, ensuring that Iran cannot regenerate the political leadership, cannot regenerate military infrastructure or nuclear capacity or regional networks necessary to become a major strategic threat ever again. Iran gets a vote, and they're attempting to preserve their regime, obtain economic relief, and also to convert whatever ability is left to control or disrupt Hormuz and make it permanent political leverage. And all of these objectives overlap only temporarily. The reported Israeli consideration of Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and Parliament Speaker Mohammed Bagher Ghali. God, how do you say this? Let's just go with Parliament Speaker Mohammed Bagher. And we'll leave his last name alone because you don't want to hear me murder an Iranian name. Poor choice of words. Mispronounce an Iranian name. Anyways, Israel has both of these individuals targeted, and it exposes the contradiction really before this whole escalation began. Washington reportedly needed those two officials alive because, well, frankly, an adversary requires some kind of authoritative representative that's capable of negotiating and enforcing a settlement. We need those two people. Israel may have regarded the same officials as potential architects of Iranian recovery. So, yeah, better the devil you know than the devil you don't, I suppose. The United States is fairly pragmatic in this instance. They understand that these two individuals have their fingers in a lot of different pies. They're deeply tied to a lot of the regime and IRGC that we're trying to topple, but they have the means and the influence to enforce a treaty. The allegation that Israel is levying that they are potential architects of Iranians' recovery, it's credible. I think the intelligence apparatus supports it, but it's unproven. Reuters reported in March that Israel removed Araghchi and Ghalibaf from potential targeting consideration after Pakistan urged Washington to intervene. That story is out there if you want to search for it. Reuters did a pretty interesting article on it. Now, Pakistan's military and foreign ministry did not publicly confirm the account. It was off the record, but it was confirmed. And Israel did not confirm that the men were ever operational targets officially. Subsequent reporting indicated that U.S. officials remained sufficiently concerned to warn Iran indirectly that the negotiators could face an Israeli threat. Israel categorically denied the reporting, calling it false and a fabrication. No Israeli operational order, targeting document, or publicly released intelligence assessment has established that a finalized assassination mission existed specifically to sabotage diplomacy. The current escalation has now damaged the diplomatic structure from a completely different direction. President Donald Trump declared the interim ceasefire effectively finished after attacks on commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz happened, authorized successive waves of strike against Iranian military capabilities, and warned that additional attacks would produce a more severe response. At the same time, he has insisted that the United States is not seeking a long war. Spoiler alert, too late, and that any renewed conflict would end quickly. Now, this is best understood as coercive bargaining under active combat conditions, and that's putting it mildly. Military strikes are being used to alter negotiating leverage on both sides. Negotiations remain available as an exit. No one's taking it. Neither side trusts the agreement. Neither side accepts the other's interpretation of Hormuz. Both sides believe additional pressure may force the other to concede. And that is precisely why this whole situation is dangerous. Limited escalation is not inherently stable. It remains limited only while every participant correctly calculates the other participant's thresholds. And while no strike produces casualties or political consequences that force a larger response. And that's just not going to happen. So the war really has entered a new phase. Let's go back to February 28th. U.S.-Israel campaign basically fundamentally altered Iran's political structure because Ali Khamenei was killed during that initial phase. Members of his family were killed. And his son, Mojtaba, I pronounced that correctly, Mojtaba, was reportedly seriously wounded before being selected as Iran's next supreme leader. The original military campaign that the U.S. and Israel conducted focused heavily on strategic leadership, nuclear infrastructure, missile and drone capabilities, air defense systems, IRGC command networks, and then really just the broader ability of the Islamic Republic to project power throughout the region. Now, the current phase, this is different. The U.S. is increasingly targeting the military architecture Iran uses to control, monitor, or threaten maritime traffic around Hormuz. CENTCOM states that U.S. forces have struck approximately 80 Iranian military targets as recent as July 7th. That includes more than 60 IRGC small boats. A subsequent operation struck approximately 90 additional targets. We're talking air defense, coastal surveillance, missile and drone storage facilities, naval capabilities, and military logistics infrastructure. And they've struck back. Iran has struck back, and there's targets and bases overseas. I think another Reaper was just shot down, which is not impossible, but we were supposed to have air superiority. Clearly we don't. The target selection reveals the operational objective. Washington is attempting to dismantle Iran's maritime denial system. So we're talking about things like coastal surveillance, radar and sensor, anti-ship, missile and drone, fast attack craft, the command and control systems that operate all of the above, and then the logistics supporting those assets. It's not retaliation. Really, this is cut and dry, and it's an attempt to reduce Iran's ability to impose conditions on international navigation. That constriction's having a lot of domestic blowback. I mean, the price of oil, the price of LNG, the price of goods and services, it's all going up. Fertilizer's going up, which means that the cost of food will eventually go up. I mean, it's all second and third order effects. Sorry, I ate an ice cube. Shouldn't have done that. We're trying to degrade Tehran's ability to lock down the strait. We're trying to take away their principal source of leverage that allows them to resist overwhelming U.S. conventional power. Now, the conflict has therefore evolved from a war primarily justified around nuclear risk. Remember that when that was the impetus for the war? Excuse me. And it's now in a contest over maritime authority, strategic coercion, and the post-war balance of power in the Persian Gulf. Shifting to the week-long funeral procession, let's talk about it. It was not simply a burial ceremony. This is a state-organized demonstration that the Islamic Republic survived the killing of its supreme leader. The sequence carried deliberate political and religious meaning. Tehran represented state authority. Qum represented clerical legitimacy. Najaf and Karbala connected Khamenei to the broader Shiite religious world and the historical narrative of martyrdom. Mashhad connected his burial to the Imam Reza shrine and transformed his death into a lasting religious and political system. Large crowds attended ceremonies across Iran and Iraq. Mourners carried Iranian flags, images of Khamenei, and red symbols associated with martyrdom and vengeance. Some banners and chants directly threatened President Trump and demanded retaliation. The turnout demonstrated several realities kind of simultaneously. The Islamic Republic, it retains a committed ideological constituency. Its religious institutions remain capable of mass mobilization. The Baji veterans organizations, and yes, I know I'm not pronouncing the Baji right. Don't yell at me. I'm an American. I speak fluent English, and that's about it. Veterans organizations, government institutions, and public sector networks retain substantial organizational reach. The other thing it showed, the state remains capable of creating national political theater despite months of war. And it is theater, make no mistake. But the crowd should not be interpreted as proof that Iranian society has in any way unified permanently behind the Islamic Republic. Participation likely included several constituencies. You have regime loyalists, religious mourners, citizens motivated by national solidarity after foreign attack, Iranians who viewed the funeral as a major historical event, and then individuals who may oppose clerical rule while also opposing U.S. and Israeli military action. And I think the distinction is strategically important. Opposition to the Islamic Republic does not automatically translate into support for foreign military attacks. They may not like their tribe, but they don't want people attacking it. A population can oppose its government and still rally around national sovereignty. Foreign attack can temporarily compress domestic political divisions without resolving the grievances that created them. And we have talked at length on this show about a lot of the grievances in that country and the roots of them. There's also economic hardship, political repression, public distrust, and the accumulated cost of war remain all of these intact beneath the mourning rituals. Reuters and Associated Press reporting continue to describe a politically divided society in which the scale of public mourning cannot be treated as a reliable referendum on support for the regime. And I fully agree with that assessment. The funeral, therefore, demonstrated regime resilience, not comprehensive national reconciliation. Who is the most important person at the funeral? It was the person that did not appear. Yep. Khamenei's replacement, his son. His continuing absence may be more strategically significant than the size of the funeral crowds. 3 of Ali Khamenei's other sons appeared publicly. Matwab B did not. He has not appeared publicly before. Hasn't appeared publicly before the Iranian population, the armed forces, senior clerics, foreign delegations, the funeral procession, or the burial ceremony. Reporting indicates that he has suffered serious injuries back in February 28th in that strike and remains concealed because of his medical condition, but also continuing security concerns. Physical injury does not automatically prevent effective leadership, obviously, right? But an invisible leader creates a different problem. Authority has to be demonstrated. So a supreme leader who cannot appear publicly, who can't address the armed forces or visibly preside over a national crisis, creates a lot of uncertainty over where practical command authority resides. The central questions are no longer ceremonial. Who is authorizing military retaliation? Who possesses final authority over negotiations? Who approves decisions concerning the nuclear program? Who arbitrates disputes among the presidency, parliament, and the IRGC and senior clerics? Who determines the threshold for attacks against U.S. forces? Who can accept a ceasefire without appearing weak? Who can enforce an agreement across Iran's competing institutions? There is insufficient public evidence to conclude that he is merely symbolic. There is increasing reason to assess that he must govern through a coalition rather than through a consolidated personal authority that his father developed over decades. The emerging structure may resemble the following, which is Motab Khamenei provides constitutional authority, dynastic continuity, and ideological legitimacy. You have the IRGC, which is providing the military power, the intelligence, of course, internal security, missile forces, and the ability to enforce state decisions. The president, Masoud Pezeshkian, God, I can't pronounce that name either. But the Iranian president will provide the civilian administration, economic management, and diplomatic legitimacy. Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf connects parliament, conservative political networks, and important elements of the security establishment. Abbas Araghchi provides diplomatic continuity as well as communications with foreign governments. So you have a lot of different people that are working interconnectedly. Senior clerics, you also have the assembly of experts. They provide religious and constitutional validation. It's a very weird system of government. The probable direction is toward a more security-dominated political system. That's really what they need right now for their own survival. I'm not advocating it. I'm just stating a fact. It doesn't necessarily mean a formal military government, though. It means that the Iranian state may become increasingly dependent upon the IRGC because they are the institution most capable of preserving continuity during war. But here's the paradox. Repeated leadership decapitation, it may not moderate Iran. It may produce a younger, more militarized, and more suspicious governing structure. Now, the targeting of these two individuals, Araghchi, I'm going to say that. That's then how I'm pronouncing it, and that's just what I'm saying. And then Ghalibaf. So those two individuals One is the foreign minister, and the other is a parliament speaker. We're going to sort of separate what is myth and truth, what is plausible, and what remains unproven. And here's what is supported right now. So Reuters reported that Israel temporarily removed both of these individuals from possible targeting considerations after Pakistan basically urged the United States to intervene, and we did. This is according to a Pakistani source cited by Reuters. Islamabad argued that eliminating these officials is going to remove the two people capable of negotiating with Washington. Later reporting indicated that the United States officials remained concerned that Israeli operations could threaten the two officials while diplomacy was active, was past tense, and that Washington used intermediaries to communicate warnings to Iran. The concern was strategically logical because the war had already eliminated senior Iranian officials. So these two had become very important to ceasefire negotiations and a lot of post-war diplomacy. So removing them is clearly going to have an effect, i.e., you are going to destroy diplomatic continuity and you are going to strengthen Iranian factions that are opposed to negotiation. Here's what remains unproven. There's no public evidence demonstrating that Israel authorized the assassination attempts, signed any orders to it, mission timetable. There's no approved Israeli military or intelligence operations. There's no proof that destroying negotiations was the primary objectives. And of course, as I said, Israel has categorically denied it. So the most responsible assessment is therefore that these two individuals were probably considered targets during Israel's broader campaign against Iranian leadership early on. U.S. and Pakistani officials appear to have feared that their removal would damage negotiations, and that was enough. Public evidence does not establish that Israel approved an assassination operation whose purpose was to sabotage the peace talks. So that distinction is critical. An Iranian official can simultaneously be a senior regime leader, a former military or security official, an influential wartime decision maker, a diplomatic negotiator, and a potential future threat in Israeli strategic planning. So just because they were considered targets does not mean that there was diplomatic sabotage, but the whole ugly mess does reveal a major strategic divergence between the United States and Israel, at least currently, right? Why do these two matter? Like, who cares? Okay, it's a good question. Well, first off, one, Iragachi is Iran's principal diplomatic interface. He has value, and he gets value because he has a lot of institutional experience. He has knowledge of Iran's negotiating history. He has access to senior leadership. He has a lot of relationships with foreign governments and the ability to translate Iranian political requirements into formal agreements. Now, his removal would not permanently eliminate Iranian diplomacy, obviously, right? But it would destroy continuity at a moment when continuity is unusually important. It could also reinforce the argument inside Iran that diplomatic engagement exposes negotiators to targeting without producing reliable security. So the other gentleman, Ghalibaf, he is more than a parliamentary official. He's a former senior IRGC commander. He's a political actor whose influence crosses civilian, conservative, and security institutions. His importance is not only that he's a moderate, and he is. His importance is that he possesses relationships with the institutions capable of approving and enforcing any agreement. He can negotiate and advocate military retaliation. He can discuss diplomatic compromise and defend Iranian control over Hormuz. And that combination is precisely what makes him valuable. War termination generally requires representatives who possess both negotiating authority and influence over coercive decisions. So, diplomats without internal power may sign agreements that they can't enforce. Military leaders without diplomatic credibility may possess power, but lack a viable mechanism for settlement. So this gentleman occupies the space between both of those functions. That makes him a strategic asset to diplomacy and potentially a strategic concern to an adversary like Israel, which is seeking long-term Iranian weakness. So this is where the United States and Israel strategically diverge. The deepest implication of the targeting episode is not whether an assassination mission was finalized. It is that Washington and Jerusalem may not share the same preferred political end state. The likely American objective here is an Iranian state that is militarily weakened, unable to close or coercively control Hormuz, restricted in its nuclear activities, limited in missile and proxy capabilities, economically pressured into compliance, but sufficiently coherent to implement agreements and prevent state collapse. And that's important. Washington requires an Iranian government that is capable of controlling the IRGC and enforcing maritime arrangements, as well as implementing nuclear restrictions. And also one that is capable of preventing uncontrolled proliferation. You also want someone who can negotiate future disputes. The U.S. does not appear to want an occupation of Iran, doesn't want responsibility for reconstructing a country of more than 90 million people. So what about Israel? What is their possible objective? Well, Israel may view a surviving, economically rehabilitated Islamic Republic as a future threat, even if they are temporarily constrained. So from that perspective, sanctions relief and diplomatic stabilization could allow Iran to rebuild its missile force, restore military infrastructure, regenerate proxy networks, construct nuclear capabilities, and eventually resume strategic pressure against Israel. So Israel may therefore prefer a deeper and more enduring degradation of Iranian state power. So this doesn't in any way prove that Israel intended to kill the negotiators, but it does explain why Washington and Israel may view the same officials very, very differently. Washington may see authoritative Iranian officials as necessary to end the war. Israel probably sees those same officials as potential architects of strategic regeneration. The current U.S. strikes temporarily reduce that divergence because, both countries support weakening Iranian military capability, but it does not resolve the question of what type of Iranian state should survive. So here's the current state of U.S. and Iran escalation, which has, taken place over the last 48, 72 hours. CENTCOM reporting says that the renewed U.S. strikes followed attacks against 3 commercial vessels which were operating around the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has not publicly accepted responsibility for all of the maritime attacks. Shocker. Washington, nevertheless, attributes the attacks to Iranian forces and describes the military response as enforcement of freedom of navigation. The U.S. operations targeted the systems most relevant to maritime coercion. So we mentioned them, small boats and the coastal defense, and got it. Iran has responded with missiles and drones, all directed at U.S. associated military infrastructure across the Gulf. They attacked locations in Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain. Jordan activated defenses against Iranian missiles as well. All of these attacks serve I don't want to say quite, but several Iranian objectives. One, They impose costs on the United States. They demonstrate that Iran retains regional strike capability. They warn Gulf governments that hosting American military forces creates exposure. They are preserving deterrence by demonstrating that U.S. attacks will not go unanswered. They reassure a lot of their hardline domestic constituencies demanding retaliation. But Iran faces a calibration problem because a weak response may damage deterrence and create the appearance that months of U.S.-Israeli operations have neutralized Iranian power. And in many ways, it has. I mean, don't underestimate them. They still have a robust capability, but it is reduced. However, an excessively successful response, particularly one producing substantial American casualties, could trigger a much larger U.S. campaign, and I think it would. So Iran's, it has to balance, it has to inflict enough damage to preserve credibility, but it doesn't want to cross a threshold that produces a uncontrolled escalation from the United States. And the United States faces a very similar problem. Washington wants to impose military costs to protect shipping. But if it expands attacks toward nuclear facilities or civilian infrastructure or senior leadership or major economic assets, then it risks changing the character of the war. The current escalation is therefore competition really in controlled punishment. The danger here is that control is assumed. It's not guaranteed. Trump's recent comments reveal 4 simultaneous messages. 1, the ceasefire may no longer constrain U.S. actions. Going back to July 8th, Trump said he believed the interim agreement was effectively over and expressed doubt about whether he still even wanted a deal. That signals that Washington no longer considers the agreement a reliable limitation on military action. And it also creates ambiguity concerning whether any diplomatic commitments remain politically binding. The other thing that Trump did was, the other thing that he said was that he continues to prefer an agreement if Iran accepts U.S. terms. A couple of days ago, this would have been July 6th, Trump said the United States would either reach an agreement or finish the job, while adding that he preferred a deal because he didn't want the Iranian people to suffer. So this indicates that diplomacy remains available, but it is diplomacy under the threat of expanded military action, which has really been the modus operandi the entire time. Number 3, additional Iranian maritime attacks will produce greater retaliation. So following the renewed U.S. strikes, Trump said the attacks were retaliation for the targeting of ships. He's warned that another incident would produce a more severe response. So he's kind of putting in a red line at that point. Lastly, Trump denies that the United States is returning to a prolonged war. He has argued that renewed military activity does not necessarily mean a return to full-scale conflict, and any action would occur quickly. This whole thing reflects a familiar strategic assumption, which is the United States can use overwhelming force for a limited period, impose cost, restore deterrence, and return to negotiations without becoming trapped in a prolonged war. But that assumption may not be correct. It may also underestimate Iran's capacity to prolong conflict through geography or maritime disruption or dispersed missile forces and attacks on regional bases. Trump's position is therefore not simply contradictory. It is a recognizable coercive strategy, which is escalate rapidly, threaten greater punishment, keep negotiations available, avoid occupation, and claim escalation dominance. You force the adversary to choose agreement over continued damage. But the weakness is that Iran may interpret that same behavior as evidence that agreements with Washington provide no protection. So if you look at it from Tehran's perspective, the United States negotiated, then they rejected Iran's interpretation of Hormuz. The economic benefits remained uncertain. Military attacks resumed. Washington then demanded additional negotiations under greater pressure. So that sequence strengthens Iranian hardliners who argue that any diplomacy with the United States merely allows the U.S. to reorganize coercion. So why does the funeral make things more difficult? The renewed strikes occurred during the culmination of Ali Khamenei's funeral. That timing changes the political meaning of military action inside Iran. The conflict is no longer presented solely through, international maritime law or nuclear negotiations or ceasefire compliance or even military deterrence. It is being integrated into a narrative of martyrdom and national survival. So the Islamic Republic can now argue the United States and Israel killed the supreme leader. Iran negotiated despite that attack. The negotiations did not prevent renewed military action. The United States resumed strikes while Iran buried its leader. Therefore, military resistance, not accommodation, is the only reliable defense of Iranian sovereignty. Whether that narrative accurately describes every stage of diplomacy, who cares, really? It's less important than its political power. Funeral symbolism raises the domestic cost of compromise. Iranian officials that support negotiations can be accused of weakness. Hardliners can now portray concessions concerning Hormuz as betrayal of the blood sacrificed during the war. The burial, therefore, links current military retaliation to national mourning. That makes the escalation more emotionally charged and much harder politically to reverse. A lot of our Gulf states are now becoming battlefields. So Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, I say Qatar, and other regional governments all occupy contradictory roles. They host American forces. They depend upon U.S. security guarantees. They maintain diplomatic or at least economic relationships with Iran. And some of them even serve as mediators. Their economies depend on stable maritime access through the Strait. Iran may view attacks on military facilities in those countries as retaliation against American infrastructure. The host governments, on the other hand, may view those attacks as direct violation of sovereignty. This creates escalating pressure on Gulf governments, and they may demand stronger American protection. They could also pressure Washington to restrict offensive operations from their territory. Qatar, for example, faces a particularly difficult position because it hosts major U.S. military infrastructure, but it's also functioning as the intermediary with Iran. Reuters reports that Qatar condemned attacks on shipping while simultaneously calling for a return to diplomacy. So the longer the conflict continues, the more difficult neutrality for Qatar becomes. Repeated attacks could force a lot of these Gulf states to participate more directly in regional defense. More direct participation would increase Iranian perceptions that those governments are belligerents. You see the problem here? You see this catch-22? This could widen the entire war geographically, even if no government deliberately wants it. U.S. military superiority does not automatically produce safe shipping. The U.S. can destroy all of this stuff. It doesn't guarantee that commercial shipping will have the confidence to navigate the strait. Shipping companies still have to respond to risk. The insurance companies are going to reflect that risk. And then the crews of the boat, from the captain down to the lowest seaman, they're the ones that have to man the ship and actually pilot it. And A relatively small number of successful attacks create a big economic consequence, much, disproportionate to their effect. Iran right now continues imposing a global risk premium. And let's not forget the nuclear issue could return in a more dangerous form. Now, I understand Hormuz is the immediate priority, but let's not forget the original premise. The nuclear issue remains the long-term strategic threat here. If Iran concludes that conventional military power and negotiated agreements don't guarantee regime survival, then there's their argument for nuclear deterrence. And it could become much more influential. You keep targeting leadership, and it's going to strengthen the factions that are advocating withdrawal from the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. Reduced cooperation with international inspectors. It is accelerating their nuclear program. All of these things. The divergence between the United States and Israel, it's going to become much more visible. The U.S. may view military pressure as a bridge back to negotiation, but Israel may view negotiations as a pause that enables Iran to rebuild. If U.S.-Israel talks, if U.S.-Iran talks resume, Israel is potentially facing a strategic decision. Do they accept a constrained Iranian state, seek stronger restrictions, or conduct independent operations against leadership, nuclear infrastructure, or regional networks? This is very hard for me not to weigh in subjectively, and I'm really trying to just let the facts speak. I'm going to continue to do so. I have some thoughts on this subject, but I'm abstaining for the minute because I promised you a unvarnished and unbiased assessment of what's taking place on the ground. So, renewed independent action on behalf of Israel would reopen the same alliance management problems that we just talked about the exposed reporting concern about whether Israel was targeting these two Iranian negotiators. Nationalism currently may strengthen the regime. A lot of these foreign attacks creates short-term cohesion. So foreign clerics Iranians who oppose clerical rule may still reject foreign military intervention. So our attacks could potentially help gain temporary political protection by presenting a lot of domestic dissent as very dangerous during wartime. Now, the effect is unlikely to resolve a lot of underlying Iranian economic and political grievances permanently, but it does do it temporarily. A lot of national solidarity under attacks like what we're presenting, it's not in any way equivalent to durable regime legitimacy, but it strengthens them. I think that this conflict could become substantially more likely to expand if any of the following tripwires occur. So high casualties against U.S. personnel, a U.S. strike against senior Iranian leadership, direct attacks on their nuclear facilities, any strike that causes a radiological emergency, an attempt to seize or permanently disable Karg Island. And we've talked about that. I mean, a couple of SITREPs back, Marines were ready to take the island along with the 82nd. Could they do it? Oh, absolutely. Could they hold it? Yeah, they probably could. It would have some pretty sizable second and third order effects. Any large scale attacks on civilian power or water infrastructure, a permanent Iranian closure or extensive mining of the Strait of Hormuz, another tanker disaster that produces mass casualties or environmental damage like a massive oil spill, any direct Gulf state participation in offensive operations, large-scale Hezbollah escalation against Israel, any Formal Iranian movement toward NPT withdrawal. Renewed Israeli targeting during the negotiations between Iran and U.S. Any public evidence that Khamenei, the new Khamenei, not his father, is incapacitated or unable to exercise authority. So, final intelligence judgment. Ali Khamenei's funeral was designed to prove that killing their leader did not destroy the state. On that very narrow question, Iran succeeded. They did. The Islamic Republic demonstrated institutional continuity, mass mobilization capacity, religious influence, diplomatic relationships, and continued ability to retaliate throughout the region. But the funeral exposed a weakness beneath the spectacle. Iran buried its former supreme leader without publicly presenting the man who replaced him. That replacement remains absent. The IRGC appears increasingly indispensable. The government's practical command structure remains opaque. The reported Israel interest in their negotiators revealed another vulnerability. Iran's remaining authoritative negotiators are now strategic assets whose very survival affects the possibility of ending the war. This allegation that Israel intended to assassinate them specifically to destroy diplomacy remains unproven, but it is suspicious. And the stronger conclusion is that Washington feared continued leadership decapitation would eliminate the people required to negotiate and enforce any kind of settlement. All of the current escalation demonstrates that assassinating negotiators was never the only way diplomacy could fail, clearly. The de-escalation framework is now being eroded by conflicting interpretations of Hormuz, attacks on commercial shipping, renewed U.S. strikes, Iranian retaliation across the Gulf, uncertainty concerning Iran's leadership, competing U.S. and Israel strategic objectives, and declining confidence that agreements provide any kind of security. Trump's recent statements suggest that Washington is attempting to combine overwhelming military pressure with a continuing diplomatic exit. He's basically signaling the agreement is no longer reliable. Iran will be punished for maritime attacks. The United States is prepared to escalate. But also, Washington does not seek a prolonged war. A negotiated settlement remains preferable if Iran accepts American requirements. And that strategy might produce renewed negotiations. It might not. It may also create a self-reinforcing escalation cycle. And I think that's what's going to happen. I do. The central danger here is not necessarily that either Washington or Tehran has deliberately chosen some unlimited war. The danger is that both governments believe limited military pressure will improve their bargaining position. Iran believes that control of the Hormuz Strait will force the United States to negotiate once and that it might be able to do it again. Whereas Washington believes superior military power will completely dismantle Iran's maritime coercive capability and compel compliance without a prolonged conflict. Meanwhile, Israel may believe that any settlement preserving a capable Islamic Republic is just delaying the next war. Those assumptions cannot all be correct. The conflict is no longer solely about whether Iran possesses a nuclear capability. Remember that? Now it's about who controls the straits, whether Iran is permitted to emerge from the war as a regional power, whether the U.S. can use military escalation without entering another prolonged military conflict in the Middle East, whether Israel accepts a negotiated Iranian survival. And then whether Iran's new leadership is capable of governing or negotiating or deterring while their leader is invisible. The funeral has ended. The succession crisis has not. The negotiators are still alive, but the negotiating system is rapidly deteriorating. The Strait of Hormuz, immediate battlefield, and the political space required to prevent a wider war is shrinking with every exchange of fire. State media in Iran may have incentives to exaggerate a lot of the national unity, the military success, and the foreign aggression. Iranian opposition sources may understate genuine nationalist or religious support for the state. And lastly, CENTCOM reporting represents the official U.S. operational account. It does not independently establish responsibility for every maritime incident. Iran has not publicly accepted responsibility for all of the attacks that has been attributed to it. Whether or not Israel is actually targeting Iranian heads of state remains disputed. Trump's public rhetoric functions simultaneously as policy communication, deterrent signaling, and negotiating pressure. A lot of the statements that he makes should not automatically be interpreted as final strategic decisions. Not really sure how to phrase that one. A lot of the stuff that comes out of his mouth is bombastic. I think we know that, right? And then, folks, look, the military situation remains active. It may change materially within hours. Okay. Wow. That was a lot. Are you still with me? Okay. All right. Good. Take a drink, because I get to say what I have been gearing up to say all evening. You ready? Release the Kraken. Why is that so fun to say? I'm such a child. I'm like 12 years old. Okay, let's change gears completely. We're going to talk about the Kraken unmanned vessel briefly. So there is this unmanned boat. Let's just call it a boat. Unmanned boat. It's this Kraken K3 Scout. And it's strategically important, not just because it's a fast unmanned boat, but it's significant because it integrates 4 really important capabilities. One, a reusable, high-speed, modular, unmanned surface vessel. You know, they constantly change the nomenclature and descriptions of a lot of these. Are they UASs? Are they UAVs? This one is a USV, an unmanned surface vessel. So the other thing that it integrates, capability number 2, is open mission architecture. So capable of accepting multiple sensor and effects packages. Effects is the new words for weapons when it comes to UAVs. Third is a meaningful payload capacity for ISR, communications, a whole bunch of stuff. Force protection, precision strikes, really cool. And lastly, this new demonstrated ability to be inserted directly into the maritime domain, meaning into the water, from aircraft. That's pretty cool. So now you don't need a port or a launch ramp or an amphibious ship or some kind of dedicated mothership. You just airdrop it. So that's pretty badass. In this month, a Beehive configured K3 was airdropped from a Royal Air Force A400M. Look it up, the platform. It's a fixed wing aircraft. It dropped it at 1,300 feet over the North Sea during 4 extracted load drops. So the same USV and the delivery platform were reused across the trial. So they picked it up and they airdropped it again. The testing included sea state 4 conditions, and that impresses me to no end. I have been in a Zodiac in sea state 3. It is not cool. So sea state 4, that's pretty robust. Waves reported up to approximately 8 feet. And this was done by the Royal Navy. Royal Navy, Kraken Technology Group, and Capewell, all of these describe the event as the first extracted load airdrop of its kind involving a USV. So operationally, this is a lot bigger than a boat being dropped out of an airplane under parachute, because we've done that before, right? But the demonstration converts the K3, the Kraken, from a relatively short-range tactical craft into an air mobile maritime mission node. And that's a lot of what these unmanned systems are really going to be excelling at is nodes, especially when they're modular like this one. So imagine, if you will, a theater commander could move the system across strategic distances by air, release it outside or near a contested littoral, and then allow the USV to conduct the final maritime approach autonomously or possibly under remote supervision. So that compresses a lot of deployment timelines. It reduces dependence on maritime basing, and it creates this new bridge, if you will, between tactical airlift and distributed naval operations. So the airdrop is only one component of this whole system. The decisive capability, it's not the hull and the parachute, it's the combined reliability of autonomy, navigation, communications, payload, cyber resilience, sustainment, and then command and control under a lot of enemy interference. Now, none of those elements have yet been validated publicly with any depth to make me declare that the K3 is a mature combat system, but the potential and the capabilities are pretty impressive. So this thing is about 8.4 meters. It's a modular unmanned surface boat. It's designed by Kraken Technology Group. It's specifically for military and security missions. Public information about this product describes a maximum displacement of, they give it in kilograms. We're not on the metric system yet. We should be, but we're not. It's 2,500 kilograms. Somebody, specifically myself, should have converted this into pounds. I didn't. It has a payload capacity of up to 600 kilograms, a maximum speed of approximately 55 knots, which is wicked fast, and a range of 650 nautical miles at 25 knots. And that's impressive too. The Kraken company advertises mission-dependent endurance of up to 30 days. It describes the platform as supporting optional electro-optical sensors, radar, sonar, comm, like a whole suite of stuff. And then kinetic and non-kinetic effectors, counter UAS systems, which is another really fun thing. You could put a flotilla of these and act as a frontline defense against swarms of aerial drones towards the larger shipping contingent. So I think that's pretty cool. The company also states that the craft is capable of operating independently or part of a distributed group or in coordination with crewed platforms. And all of those capabilities are, I mean, that's really impressive. Now, these are all manufacturer-described capabilities. There's no evidence that every mission package is currently fielded, certified, or even operationally proven. The current architecture does reportedly support a spectrum from remote operation all the way to supervised autonomy. It has collision avoidance, sensor fusion, you name it, a structure like this has it. So this is more than just an autonomous boat, speedboat, really. This is marketed as a modular payload truck whose operational identity changes according to whatever, mission package it is installed. So during the trial, the Royal Navy reported that the Kraken was dropped 4 times from this A400M. It used an extracted load aerial delivery system that is developed by Capewell. So Capewell was the manufacturer of the parachute system, basically. And this whole thing was conducted in support of Project Beehive, which is the Royal Navy initiative intended to accelerate integration of a lot of these autonomous and uncrewed systems. The delivery system used the Universal Maritime Craft Aerial Delivery System, or UMCADS. The U.S. has something very, very similar. LCADS, I guess they just changed it to make it maritime. Let's see, what else can we talk about when it comes to this? Yeah, it's pretty interesting. You have a drogue chute. They call it an extraction parachute. It draws the loaded aerial delivery platform from the craft's rear cargo, and then the main parachute decelerates the load. That's pretty standard, really. The most relevant details are 4 live drops, all from 1,300 feet. You will use the same Kraken and the same delivery platform for all 4. Sea state 4 conditions, which again impresses the hell out of me. And it's intended to transition from aerial delivery into maritime operation without requiring any support ship or port facility. And the fact that they reused it, in my mind, is actually more important than a single delivery demonstration, because doing this 4 times suggests that the Kraken's hull, its internal systems, and recovery architecture basically handled being airdropped 4 times, which is punishing. It didn't break. It continued to run. Yeah. It wasn't a one-time use system. So that's pretty robust. But 4 airdrops involving 1 vessel does remain a limited test sample. So you did not establish fleet level reliability or long-term fatigue life or operational availability, anything like that. Janes reports that the airdrop from the A400M is, well, they reported as the world's first extracted load airdrop of a USV. I found no publicly documented precedent that displaces it or that disputes that claim, so I'm just going to let that sit on fact. But it's very narrowly scoped, right? Airdropping boats is not new. The novelty, if you will, is the extraction, the release, the water entry, and the operational transition of a modern USV using the A400M. So, yeah, I suppose you get credit for being the first, but it's very narrow in scope. All that being said, I'm not taking anything away from this. The airdrop changes the operational equation. It breaks the small USV deployment bottleneck. Small and medium USVs, like the ones that rescued those 2 pilots, they face a basic operational problem. They may be fast at sea, but they still possess limited self-deployment range relative to the size of a theater. They ordinarily require 1 or more of the following in order to work, right? You need a nearby naval or commercial port, a road-accessible launch ramp, a crane or ramp, some kind of mothership, a transport vessel, and then a long and potentially detectable self-transit. So the A400M concept allows the aircraft to perform the strategic and operational movement, while the K3 Kraken, let's call it the Kraken, performs basically the final maritime leg. The Royal Navy explicitly framed the demonstration as a means of extending deployment speed, range, and flexibility beyond the limitations of small vessel deployment. Operationally, this could reduce deployment time from days to hours in some contingencies. It could allow a lot of forces to reposition maritime sensors without waiting for surface lift. So this creates the mother aircraft. Navies, they've spent years examining uncrewed systems deployed from motherships. So the Kraken trial introduces a, complementary concept, the mother aircraft. The aircraft doesn't have to remain in the maritime battle space. You fly in, you drop the boat, and then you're out of there. And then the boat conducts whatever low signature portion of the mission it needs to do. And I think that's pretty clever. It's this new cross-domain maneuver chain, airlift base, aircraft deployment, maritime drop zone, autonomous transport, and then either distributed sensor or effect node. I really don't like that term. Why do we have to call it effects? Kinetic. Let's stick with kinetic. This works really well when you have theaters where there's no friendly ports, or they're sparse, or they're damaged, or they're politically restricted, monitored, mined, or maybe even inside enemy missile range. So it's a nice little bit of kit. Okay, so that's the Kraken. More on that if it pops up. Other than that, we're just going to kind of leave that there. I like doing little technology segments so that we're all aware of the latest and greatest in warfare, because I kind of think that it's going to become really important here in a couple of years. All right. Let's transition to a question from a listener. I'm getting dangerously low on my gin and tonic. David Jeans D1B asks, did you actually roll into Iraq with an M16 with a massive night optic and 203 underneath? I imagine that'd be annoying to work with riding shotgun. Yes. I mean, the short answer is yes and no. It was not an M16. It was an M4. It was a Colt M4 with some Knights armament rail systems. And yes, it was a PVS 17 night optic. It was a M203 40 millimeter underbarrel grenade launcher. And I had, smoke and parachute flares and HE. I had a few different round selections for that. Was it unwieldy riding shotgun? Annoying? Yeah, I mean, it was a little much inside the Humvee. If I had to do it again, I would have stripped all that off. I think I've said that a couple of times before, especially in the last AMA. I think we talked about that. But in the vehicle, not having to carry all that weight, it worked. The PVS 17 has been replaced by something that is much, much smaller these days. They're integrated and fused with thermal in many cases. It took place in 2003. If it was in 2026, it would have been a completely different setup. But yeah, I did. Was it annoying? A little bit. Wasn't terrible though. Hope that answered your question, and thanks. And we'll answer another question. And let's wrap up. Bottom line, tonight's stories. These are not separate stories. They are all about control. Iran is fighting to control the Straits of Hormuz because geography is leverage. Control the water, and you influence the movement of energy, commerce, military power, and the decisions of nations thousands of miles away. Then look at the Kraken K3 Scout, an unmanned vessel dropped from an A400M directly into the sea. No port, no launch ramp, no mothership waiting offshore. That is not just a new way to deploy a drone boat. That is the ability to put surveillance, force protection, sensors, and potentially precision effects into contested waters before a traditional fleet can establish itself. Air power, delivering maritime power. Who knew? Machines extending presence into terrain without immediately placing sailors inside the threat envelope. Then there is Congress and the FY27 NDAA. While one debate focused on removing the proposed U.S.-Israel Defense Technology Initiative, Congress never allowed that amendment a floor vote. And beneath the politics is a larger strategic question. Who gets connected to the American defense ecosystem? Who shares the intelligence? Who develops the technology? Who trains together? Whose systems communicate? And whose military relationships become so deeply integrated that separating them becomes harder than keeping them together? Because information is terrain now. Data is terrain. Technology is terrain. Relationships are terrain. And alliances are not built only through treaties anymore. They are built through shared sensors, common networks, joint research, interoperable weapons, integrated supply chains, and the trust required to decide who is allowed inside them. Back in Iran, a supreme leader has been buried while his successor remains largely unseen. The negotiators, who may be necessary to stop the war, remain political or politically strategic targets. And the strait has become both battlefield and bargaining chip. So, the real question across every one of these stories is the same. Who controls access? Access to the water, access to the technology, access to the information, access to the alliance, and access to the people authorized to make the next decision. Because the next war may not begin with an invasion. It may begin when one side controls the network, the other controls the choke point, and both believe their leverage is strong enough to make the other blink. Everybody wants escalation dominance. Everybody believes technology creates control. Everybody assumes one more move will improve the bargaining position, but technology can expand reach, cannot eliminate friction. Information can shorten the supply chain. It cannot guarantee good judgment. And an alliance can multiply power while also multiplying obligation, exposure, and consequence. You see, folks, the battlefield is no longer just the ground beneath your boots. It is the sea lane, the sensor feed, the data link, the defense laboratory, the political relationship, and the human being on the other end of the line who still has enough authority to stop the shooting. Control the terrain, and you may control the fight. Control the information, and you may control the tempo. Control the relationships, and you may shape the war before the first round is fired. But remove every leader, close every channel, and convince yourself that superior technology makes escalation predictable, and you may win every engagement while building a war nobody knows how to end. And that's how it is. Until next week, this is the Iceman, reminding all of you, wherever you are, to stay frosty.
Improvise, adapt, and overcome.